The air on the night of October 23, 2008, was crisp with the first real bite of autumn, carrying the scent of rain-soaked asphalt and decaying leaves through the sprawling parking lot of St. Michael's Medical Center in Portland, Oregon. Inside, the fluorescent lights of the oncology ward cast a sterile, unwavering glow, a stark contrast to the emotional storms that brewed within its walls. Nurse Evelyn Evie Red, a woman whose compassion was as much a part of her uniform as her stethoscope, moved with a gentle efficiency, her soft-soled shoes whispering against the polished linoleum. Her shift was ending, a grueling 12 hours of administering chemotherapy, managing pain, and offering quiet words of comfort to patients and their grieving families. To her colleagues, Evie was a pillar of calm in a sea of perpetual crisis. She had a rare ability to connect with people on a deeply human level. Her warm smile, a small but potent antidote to the fear and uncertainty that clung to the ward like antiseptic. On this particular Wednesday night, she had spent hours with the family of a young father who was losing his battle with an aggressive cancer. Her presence a silent, steady anchor. She charted her final notes, the familiar scratch of her pen a rhythmic, comforting sound in the late-hour quiet of the nurse's station. Her movements were tired but methodical, the practiced routine of a professional wrapping up another demanding day. Her last conversation was with a junior nurse, a fresh-faced 22-year-old named Sarah, to whom Evie had been a mentor. "You did good today, Sarah," she'd said, her voice a little weary but kind. "Remember to take a deep breath before you walk through your front door. Leave the weight of this place here." Sarah watched as Evie gathered her things, slipping her well-worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird into a canvas tote bag, a book she reread every year. She shrugged on her grey peacoat, its collar already turned up in anticipation of the autumn chill that awaited her outside. The clock on the wall read 11:12 p.m. when Evie pushed through the heavy double doors of the ward for the last time. The hallway beyond was deserted, the usual daytime bustle replaced by a profound, almost unnerving, silence. Her footsteps echoed slightly as she walked towards the West Wing exit, the quickest route to the employee parking structure. The scent of bleach and floor wax was sharp in the air, a smell so familiar it was practically unnoticeable to her. After 8 years of service at St. Michael's, it was the smell of her second home, a place of both profound sorrow and incredible resilience. At home, her husband Mark was waiting. He had put their 4-year-old daughter, Lily, to bed hours ago, her small hand clutching a crayon drawing she'd made for her mummy. A plate of leftover lasagna, Evie's favorite, was covered in foil on the counter, ready to be heated. Mark glanced at the clock, a familiar knot of worry tightening in his stomach as midnight approached. Evie was meticulous about calling if she was running late, even by 10 minutes. He pictured her driving her familiar blue Honda Civic, humming along to the classic rock station she loved, her mind slowly unwinding from the pressures of the ward. But as the minutes ticked by, turning into an hour, the silence in their cozy, suburban home grew heavy, suffocating. Mark's calls to Evie's cell phone went straight to voicemail, each unanswered ring amplifying his dread. He called the hospital, his voice tight with feigned calmness, only to be told by the night supervisor that Evelyn Reed had clocked out on time, just after 11. She had left the building. There was no record of any accidents on her route, no emergencies that would have called her back. The first tendrils of real panic began to creep in, cold and sharp. Mark stood in the dimly lit kitchen, the silence of the house pressing in on him. He walked to the front window, peering out into the empty rain-slicked street, as if he could will her car to appear around the corner. The world outside there, home, was asleep, peaceful and unaware of the nightmare that was just beginning to unfold within its walls. The lasagna on the counter remained cold, a forgotten relic of a normal evening that had somehow, somewhere, gone terribly wrong. He called her phone again, and then again, the repetitive, hollow sound of the voicemail prompt becoming a torturous mantra. He paced the length of the living room, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Every creak of the house, every distant siren, sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. This wasn't like Evie. It wasn't just unusual. It was impossible. She was the most dependable person he knew, a creature of habit and responsibility, a devoted mother who lived for the moment she could walk in and kiss her sleeping daughter's head. The thought of Lily, sleeping soundly in her bed upstairs, unaware that her world was teetering on the brink of collapse, was what finally broke him. He sank onto the sofa, his head in his hands, the image of Evie's smiling face flashing. In his mind, he saw her at their wedding. He saw her holding Lily for the first time. He saw her just that morning, kissing him goodbye before heading off to a job that she believed was her calling. Where was she? What had happened in that short, unlit journey? From the hospital door to her car, as the first grey light of dawn threatened to break through the darkness, a new, terrifying reality began to set in. Evelyn Reed, a loving wife, a doting mother, a dedicated nurse, had walked out of the hospital and into the night, disappearing as if she had never been there at all. The last goodbye she had given to her colleagues was unknowingly a final one. The mystery of her whereabouts was a void, an empty space that would soon consume her family, her friends, and the police, leaving behind only questions and a silence that would stretch on for years. The call to the Portland Police Bureau came in at 5:47 a.m., logged as a potential missing person. By the time Detective Miles Miller arrived at the Reed residence, the sun was casting long, somber shadows across the manicured lawn. Mark Reed's face was a mask of sleepless exhaustion and raw fear, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. He recounted the night's events in a fractured, desperate voice, his hands trembling as he clutched a photo of Evie, a vibrant, smiling woman with kind eyes, frozen in a moment of happiness. Miller, a veteran of the force with a weary but perceptive gaze, listened patiently, the details painting a deeply unsettling picture. Detective Miller's first stop after leaving the Reed home was St. Michael's Medical Center. The hospital was now in the full swing of its morning routine, a chaotic symphony of rattling gurneys, overhead pages, and hurried conversations. Miller's presence, and authoritative, cut through the noise. He started with the basics: security footage. The camera covering the West Wing exit showed a clear, if grainy, image of Evie pushing through the doors at 11:12 p.m. She was alone, walking with purpose, her tote bag slung over her shoulder. But that was the last glimpse. The parking structure, a massive multi-level concrete labyrinth, offered the first major dead end. Its surveillance system, outdated even for 2008, was a patchwork of grainy low-resolution cameras, many of which were malfunctioning. The camera aimed at the entrance to the third level, where Evie always parked, had been offline for a week, awaiting a maintenance part. There was no footage of her entering the structure, no image of her 1999 blue Honda Civic, leaving it was a digital black hole, a crucial gap in the timeline that was as frustrating as it was suspicious. Miller and his partner, Detective Chen, began the painstaking process of interviewing Evie's colleagues from the oncology ward. They described her as they always did: professional, caring, the emotional bedrock of the unit. No one could recall anything unusual about her behavior on her final shift. She wasn't distressed or agitated. She hadn't mentioned any personal problems or plans to go anywhere after work. She was just Evie, a steady presence who had simply vanished. The interviews yielded a portrait of a beloved woman, but no tangible leads, deepening the sense of mystery that the search of the parking structure itself was a meticulous, frustrating exercise. Officers fanned out, their flashlights cutting through the dimly lit corners, checking every level, every space. They were looking for her car, for any sign of a struggler-dropped purse, a broken key, a smear of blood. But they found nothing. Her designated parking spot, number 3B, was empty. The concrete floor was clean, stained only with the usual oil drips and tire marks of 1,000 other vehicles. It was as if she and her car had been erased from existence the moment she stepped out of the camera's view. As the first 48 hours bled away, the case grew colder with each passing hour. Miller felt a familiar pit in his stomach, the one that came with cases where the trail went ice cold, almost immediately. These were the ones that haunted you. He re-interviewed Mark Reed, gently but firmly probing into their marriage. Mark was adamant they were happy. There were the usual stresses of a young family, juggling demanding jobs and raising a child, but no deep-seated issues, no secrets, no infidelity. She would never, ever leave Lily, he repeated, his voice cracking, with a grief so profound it was palpable. The investigation turned to Evie's personal life outside of work. Detectives examined her bank records, which showed no unusual activity. Her last transaction was buying groceries 2 days before she disappeared. Her credit cards were untouched. Her cell phone records showed her last call was to the hospital's pharmacy earlier in her shift. There was no digital trail, no financial footprint to suggest she had planned to run away or was meeting someone. She had simply been on her way home from work, a journey she had made 1,000 times before. Back at St. Michael's, an unnerving quiet had settled over the oncology ward. The nurses spoke in hushed tones, their faces etched with worry and fear. The empty chair at the nurses' station where Evie used to sit felt like a shrine. The hospital administration was cooperative, but an undercurrent of institutional anxiety was evident. They were concerned about their reputation, about the safety of their staff. The disappearance of one of their own from their very doorstep was a chilling indictment of their security, a fact that was not lost on the increasingly nervous employees. Miller found himself staring at the grainy security footage of Evie leaving the hospital, playing it over and over. He watched her turn her collar up against the cold, a small, unconscious gesture. There was nothing in her posture to suggest fear or that she was being followed. She looked like any other tired employee at the end of a long shift. Yet somewhere, in the 50-yard walk from that door to the parking garage, her life had taken a terrifying and unknown detour. The lack of evidence was itself a piece of evidence, suggesting a swift, silent, and terrifyingly efficient abduction. At the end of the second day, with no car, no body, and no credible leads, the case was already threatening to stall. Detective Miller stood in the empty parking spot, 3B, the cool concrete under his feet, feeling like a gravesite. The air was thick with unanswered questions. Was this a random act of violence, a predator lying in wait in the shadowy corners of the garage? Or was it something more personal, perpetrated by someone who knew her routine, knew the blind spots in the hospital's security? This question hung in the air, a chilling cliffhanger in the real-life drama of the vanished nurse. The Reed home, once a sanctuary of warmth and laughter, had transformed into a sterile headquarters for a search effort. The scent of coffee and anxiety replaced the familiar smell of Evie's baking. Family photos on the mantelpiece of Evie and Mark on their wedding day. A giggling Lily on her father's shoulders. Evie in her nursing scrubs, with a proud smile, seemed to mock the somber reality of the present. Each image was a painful reminder of a life that had been violently interrupted, a future that was now a terrifying blank canvas. The house was full of people, yet it felt profoundly empty. Mark moved through the days in a fog of disbelief and gut-wrenching sorrow. He was a ghost in his own home, answering the same questions from detectives, family members, and friends, his voice growing hoarse and his spirit more frayed with each repetition. He clung to the mundane details of their last morning together, replaying it in his mind 1,000 times. She had kissed him goodbye, a quick, familiar peck, and said, "Don't let Lily have too much juice before bed." He had waved from the doorway as her blue Honda disappeared down the street. How could he have known it was the last time he would ever see her? Their daughter, Lily, was the epicenter of his pain and his reason for holding on. At 4 years old, she couldn't grasp the permanence of the situation. "When is Mummy coming home from the hospital?" she would ask, her innocent question a dagger to Mark's heart. He would mumble something about Mummy having to help a lot of people, his words feeling like ash in his mouth. He tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy for her, reading her bedtime stories and making her favorite pancakes, but the effort was a monumental struggle against the tide of his own despair. Days turned into a week. Friends and neighbors organized search parties, combing through the wooded areas and parks near the hospital, their hopeful determination slowly eroding with each fruitless search. Flyers bearing Evie's smiling face were stapled to telephone poles and taped to storefront windows all over Portland. Her image was everywhere, a constant, public broadcast of Mark's private agony. He would see her face on the evening news and feel a disorienting blend of hope that it might generate a lead and a deep, visceral violation of their stolen privacy. In a desperate attempt to find something, anything, the police had asked Mark to go through Evie's personal belongings. He found himself in her closet, the scent of her perfume hanging in the air, a ghostly presence. He ran his hand over her clothes, each texture a memory. It was there, tucked away in a jewelry box, that he found a small, unfamiliar item, a single, ornate silver key. It wasn't for their house, their cars, or their post office box. He had never seen it before. For a fleeting moment, hope surged through him. Could this be a clue? A key to a locker, a secret apartment, a hidden part of her life? He presented the key to Detective Miller with trembling hands. The discovery sent a ripple of excitement through the investigative team. It was the first tangible, unexplained object they had found. They spent days trying to identify it, taking it to locksmiths, apartment managers, and storage facilities across the city. The hope it represented was a fragile, precious thing in the face of the overwhelming lack of evidence. It was a tangible link to Evie, a piece of her world that they didn't yet understand, a potential key to unlocking the entire mystery. But the hope was short-lived. After an exhaustive search, the key remained a mystery. No lock it fit could be found. It led them down a dozen dead-end paths, each one chipping away at their optimism. The key, once a symbol of hope, became just another frustrating enigma in a case full of them. For Mark, the disappointment was crushing. Another heavy blow in a relentless assault of grief and frustration. It felt as if the world was conspiring to keep Evie's fate a secret. The emotional toll on Mark was immense. Sleep offered no escape. His dreams filled with nightmarish scenarios, or, even worse, with blissful moments with Evie that made waking up an excruciating rediscovery of his loss. He would find himself dialing her number, just to hear her voice on the voicemail message she'd recorded months earlier. A cheerful, melodic greeting that now sounded like a message from another lifetime. The sound of her voice was both a comfort and a form of self-torture. The search parties eventually dwindled. The news cycle moved on to other stories. The constant presence of friends and family began to recede as people returned to their own lives, their own routines. Mark and Lily were left in the echoing silence of their home, the initial, frantic energy of the investigation replaced by a slow, gnawing ache of uncertainty. The police assured him they weren't giving up, but Mark could see the case was growing cold, the leads drying up. He sat in Lily's room one night, watching her sleep, her small chest rising and falling rhythmically. He thought about the silver key, now sealed in an evidence bag at the police station. It represented everything about this nightmare, a seemingly significant clue that led nowhere, a promise of answers that dissolved into more questions. Was it a key to understanding her disappearance, or was it just a meaningless trinket, a red herring in a story with no clear villain and no final chapter? The mystery of the key was a mirror of the larger mystery of Evie herself, leaving him stranded in a limbo of not knowing. As the official police investigation began to hit a wall, a different kind of inquiry was taking place within the sprawling complex of St. Michael's Medical Center. It was an investigation conducted not by detectives, but by whispers. In the hushed conversations in the break rooms, the quiet gossip exchanged over cafeteria trays, and the speculative chatter in the elevator, the staff of St. Michael's tried to solve the puzzle of Evie Reed's disappearance themselves. The hospital, once a place of healing and order, had become a breeding ground for rumor and suspicion. The initial theory, shared among many, was that of a tragic but impersonal crime. A predator, they whispered, must have been hiding in the shadows of the poorly lit parking garage, waiting for a lone female employee. This narrative was terrifying because it meant it could have been any of them. Nurses began walking to their cars in groups, security escort requests skyrocketed, and a palpable layer of fear coated the end of every late shift. The hospital administration responded by upgrading the lighting and promising to fix the broken security cameras. But these measures did little to quell the deep-seated anxiety that had taken root. Soon, however, the whispers began to take on a more personal, more insidious tone. People started to dissect Evie's life, searching for a hidden darkness that might explain her fate. Was the quiet, compassionate nurse really who she seemed to be? A few colleagues recalled seeing her in what appeared to be a tense conversation with an unknown man in the hospital lobby a few weeks before she vanished. The man was well-dressed, but his posture was aggressive. At the time, they had thought nothing of it, but now, the memory was cast in a sinister new light. This led to the inevitable, painful speculation about her marriage. Despite Mark's heartfelt pleas and declarations of their happiness, some hospital staff began to wonder. You never really know what goes on behind closed doors. One orderly commented to another. They wondered if Evie was having an affair, if the mysterious man in the lobby was a secret lover. This theory, though baseless, was tempting because it offered a motive, a character, plot. It was a way to make sense of the senseless, even if it meant tarnishing the memory of a woman they had once respected. The internal hospital investigation, led by their head of security, a stern ex-cop named Frank, did little to help matters. Frank's methods were clumsy, and his interviews often felt like interrogations. He seemed more concerned with protecting the hospital from liability than with finding Evie. His focus was on employee conduct, searching for any breach of protocol that might have contributed to the incident. His inquiries only fueled the rumor mill, making staff feel like suspects in their own workplace and creating an atmosphere of distrust. One particularly persistent rumor centered on a doctor on the ward, a charismatic but reportedly arrogant surgeon who had shown a more than professional interest in Evie. Some nurses recalled him paying her compliments, finding excuses to be at the nurses' station when she was there. Evie had always politely brushed it off, but now, in the vacuum of her absence, these interactions were re-examined. Had his interest turned into an obsession? Did she reject him, leading to a violent confrontation? The surgeon had a solid alibi for the night of her disappearance, but in the court of hospital gossip, he remained a person of interest. Detective Miller was aware of the whispers. He and his team spent days chasing down these hospital rumors, interviewing the surgeon, and trying to identify the mystery man from the lobby. Each lead evaporated under scrutiny. The surgeon's alibi was ironclad. The mystery man turned out to be the distressed son of a former patient, who had been arguing with Evie about his father's end-of-life, emotional but ultimately harmless encounter. The rumors were just that. Ghosts born of fear and a desperate need for answers. The atmosphere on the oncology ward itself became toxic. The camaraderie that had once defined the unit was fractured by suspicion. Nurses who had been friends for years now looked at each other with a flicker of doubt. Every odd comment, every strange mood, was scrutinized. The very air in the ward, which had once been filled with a sense of shared purpose, was now thick with a quiet paranoia. The search for Evie was no longer just about finding a missing person. It was about trying to reclaim a sense of safety and trust that had been shattered. The hospital administration, in a move seen by many as damage control, began to subtly distance themselves from the case. They issued a final formal statement, expressing their sorrow and their hopes for Evie's safe return. Then the official communication ceased. The focus shifted back to daily operations, patient care, and budget meetings. To the outside world, St. Michael's was moving on. But for the employees who walked its halls every day, Evie's ghost was everywhere, a constant, silent presence in the building she had never truly left. As weeks turned into months, the whispers faded into a low, persistent hum of unresolved mystery. The theories and rumors, once spoken with urgent conviction, became tired stories, part of the hospital's institutional folklore. The sharp edges of fear and suspicion were worn down by time, leaving behind a dull ache of sadness. But the fundamental question remained unanswered, hanging in the sterile air of the hospital corridors. If a random attacker wasn't responsible, and it wasn't a crime of passion from a secret life, then what had happened? The truth, it seemed, was more elusive and perhaps more terrifying than any of the rumors had imagined. A year after Evelyn Reed vanished, the case file on Detective Miller's desk was thick with paperwork but barren of meaningful leads. The initial flurry of activity had subsided into a frustrating stillness. The state crime lab had found no forensic evidence in the packing garage. The mysterious silver key remained unidentified. The hundreds of tips that had poured in during the first few weeks had all been investigated and dismissed. The case, once a top priority that dominated local news, was now officially classified as cold, a bureaucratic term that felt like a profound failure. For Detective Miller, the file was a constant, nagging reminder of his inability to provide answers. He would pull it out on slow afternoons, staring at Evie's smiling photo, her kind eyes seeming to question him. He went over the timeline again and again, searching for a detail he might have missed, an inconsistency he hadn't seen. He read the interviews with Mark, with the hospital staff, with Evie's friends. He drove the route from the hospital to her home, trying to imagine what she might have seen, what could have gone wrong. But the path was unremarkable, a simple suburban drive. The media attention had long since faded. The "Have you seen Evie Reed?" flyers, battered by a year of wind and rain, were peeling off the telephone poles, her face faded by the sun. For the public, she was becoming a forgotten story, a sad but distant memory. For the police department, with new cases demanding their limited resources, the Reed investigation was relegated to a lower priority. It would remain open, they assured Mark, but active investigation would cease unless new information came to light. Mark Reed, in the meantime, was navigating a life he had never imagined. The first year had been a blur of grief, legal processes, and the immense challenge of being a single parent to a traumatized child. He had to have Evie declared legally dead to sort out their finances, a process that felt like a final, brutal betrayal. He sold their house, the silence and the memories within its walls having become unbearable. He and Lily moved to a small apartment in a different part of the city, a desperate attempt to outrun the ghost of their former life. Lily, now 5, had stopped asking when Mummy was coming home. She had started talking about her in the past tense. She would have moments of profound sadness, suddenly bursting into tears without understanding why. Mark did his best to be both mother and father, a monumental task for a man still drowning in his own unresolved sorrow. He enrolled her in therapy, hoping it would give her the tools to process a loss that he himself could not comprehend. His life was now entirely centered around his daughter, a fierce, protective love born from shared tragedy. He tried to keep hope alive, but it was a flickering, fragile flame. Every few months, he would call Detective Miller, his voice weary, asking the same question, anything new? The answer was always a gentle but firm no. The calls became less frequent as the years began to pile up. The sharp, acute pain of the initial loss slowly morphed into a chronic, dull ache, a permanent part of his emotional landscape. He was moving forward, not because he was forgetting Evie, but because he had to for Lily's sake. The community of friends and family who had been so present in the beginning had their own lives to lead. The casseroles stopped coming. The check-in calls became less frequent. It wasn't that they didn't care. It was the natural, if painful, progression of time. Mark found himself increasingly isolated in his grief. He was a member of a club no one wanted to join, those left behind, the ones tasked with navigating the ambiguous loss of a missing loved one, forever caught between hope and despair. On the 3rd anniversary of her disappearance, a local news station ran a brief, 30-second segment on the case. They showed Evie's photo, mentioned the lack of leads, and provided the number for the cold case hotline. The segment generated a handful of calls, but none provided any credible information. It was a fleeting reminder to the city that a nurse had vanished, but for Mark, it was a painful reopening of a wound that had never truly healed. He turned off the television and held a sleeping Lily a little tighter. Detective Miller, watching the same news segment at home, felt a familiar pang of frustration. He knew that, statistically, the chances of solving a case like this diminished dramatically with each passing year. The evidence degrades, memories fade, and people move on. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that the answer was right there, buried somewhere in the initial statements, hidden within the walls of St. Michael's Hospital. It was a puzzle with a missing piece, and he feared that piece was lost forever. Years continued to pass. Mark Reed eventually met someone new, a kind woman who understood his past and loved Lily as her own. They married in a small, quiet ceremony. For the first time in a long time, there was a sense of stability, a flicker of new happiness in their lives. But the shadow of Evie's absence was always there, a silent guest at their dinner table. The cold case file was moved from Miller's old desk to a dusty shelf in the police department's archives, a forgotten story waiting for a final, improbable chapter that no one believed would ever be written. 17 years is a lifetime. For Lily Reed, it was almost her entire life. Now a poised and thoughtful 21-year-old, she possessed her mother's kind eyes, a fact that her father, Mark, pointed out with a mixture of pride and sorrow. She had no conscious memories of Evie, only a collection of stories told by her father, faded photographs, and the abstract sense of a profound and defining loss. Her mother was a myth, a saintly figure in the family lore, the vanished nurse, whose story was the tragic prologue to her own. Lily grew up under the shadow of St. Michael's Medical Center. She had researched her mother's disappearance with a quiet intensity, reading the old news articles and online forums dedicated to cold cases. She knew every detail that was public knowledge: the time Evie clocked out, the broken security camera, the fruitless search. The case had shaped her in ways she was still discovering. It had instilled in her a deep empathy for others, a maturity beyond her years, and a powerful desire to bring comfort to those in pain, which led her to study psychology. At Portland State University, Mark Reed had built a new life. He was happy with his wife Sarah, and they had a teenage son together, Lily's half-brother. Their home was filled with the noise and warmth of a family, yet the ghost of Evie remained. It was in the way Mark would sometimes fall silent, his gaze distant, on a crisp October evening. It was in the box of Evie's belongings he kept in the attic, unable to part with them. Sarah was patient and understanding, but she knew there was a part of her husband's heart that would forever belong to the woman whose fate remained a mystery. Detective Miles Miller had retired from the Portland Police Bureau 5 years prior. His hair was grayer, his movements a little slower, but his mind was as sharp as ever. Of the dozens of cases he had worked on in his long career, Evie Reed's was one of the few that he considered a true failure, and it gnawed at him. He kept a private, unofficial copy of the case file at his home, occasionally spreading the contents across his dining room table, a habit that drove his wife crazy. He still believed the answer lay somewhere within the hospital itself. C. Michaels Medical Center had changed dramatically over 17 years. It had expanded, building a new state-of-the-art trauma wing. The old, crumbling parking structure had been torn down and replaced. Most of the staff who had worked there in 2008 were long gone, retired, or moved on to other jobs. The story of the vanished nurse was now little more than a ghost story, a piece of hospital lore told to new employees to spook them. Its tragic, human element all but forgotten by the institution. The world had changed too. Technology had made leaps and bounds. In 2008, DNA forensics was still developing, and social media was in its infancy. Now, advanced DNA testing could extract profiles from the smallest traces of evidence, and the interconnectedness of the digital world meant secrets were much harder to keep. But for a case as cold as Evie's, with no new evidence to analyze, these advancements were useless. The silence of the past 17 years was deafening. For Lily, the silence was a constant presence. She often wondered about the woman who gave her life. What were her dreams? What did her laugh sound like? Did she have any secrets? She felt an odd connection to the mother she never knew, a bond forged in absence. She sometimes visited the memorial garden that had been planted outside the new hospital wing, a small plaque bearing her mother's name among dozens of others. She would sit on the bench, close her eyes, and try to feel something, anything, a connection across the void of time. The official case file, number 087431, sat in a banker's box in a climate-controlled police archive facility. It was a relic, a testament to a time of unanswered questions. No one had requested to see it in over a decade. The system had moved on. The wheels of justice, for all their grinding, had produced nothing. The disappearance of Evelyn Reed was, for all intents and purposes, a closed book with a missing final page. Hope had withered into a sad acceptance of the unknown. Mark had made a fragile peace with the ambiguity. He had learned to live with the not knowing, focusing on the family he had now, on the future. But for Lily, the story felt unfinished. She was a young woman on the cusp of her own life, yet she felt tethered to her mother's unresolved past. The silence surrounding Evie's disappearance was not an ending. It was a perpetual state of waiting, a long drawn-out breath that had been held for 17 years. As the 17th anniversary approached in October of 2025, no one expected anything to change. It would be another quiet, somber day of remembrance for Mark and Lily. Detective Miller would likely pull out his old file and stare at Evie's photo. St. Michael's would continue its daily rhythm of life and death, oblivious to the secret it still held. The silence seemed permanent, unbreakable. But deep within the hospital's oldest, most forgotten corners, a routine maintenance task was about to change everything. George Kowalski was a man who knew the secret passages of St. Michael's Medical Center better than anyone. For 30 years, he had been part of the hospital's maintenance crew. A quiet, unassuming man with a perpetually grease-stained uniform and a jangling ring of keys that could grant access to the building's hidden anatomy. He knew the labyrinthian tunnels of the sub-basement, the cramped service shafts that ran between the walls, and the dusty, forgotten storage rooms that hadn't been opened in decades. In the spring of 2025, George was tasked with a project that would lead him deep into one of those forgotten spaces. The hospital was finally decommissioning the Old North Wing, a section of the original 1950s building that had been used for storage. Since the new towers were built, it was a time capsule, a place of peeling paint, antiquated equipment, and a thick, undisturbed layer of dust that seemed to swallow sound. George's job was to go through the wing, room by room, and assess the plumbing and electrical systems for safe shutdown before the demolition crews moved in. It was a tedious, solitary job, but George preferred it that way. The air in the north wing was heavy and stagnant, smelling of decay and old paper. His flashlight beam cut a path through the gloom, illuminating ghostly shapes draped in white, cloth-soled gurneys, defunct medical machinery, stacks of patient files from an era before digital records. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of his boots on the gritty floor and the low hum of the emergency lights. He worked his way methodically from the top floor down, his movements practiced and unhurried. On his third day in the wing, he reached the ground floor, a former administrative area. He consulted his old faded blueprints, a relic from a time when architects drew by hand. The plans showed a small janitorial closet tucked behind what used to be the records office. But when he found the location, there was no door, only a seamless stretch of drywall. It was odd. George ran his hand along the wall, feeling for any inconsistencies. His knuckles rapped against a hollow spot. Someone had sealed it up. Curiosity piqued. George retrieved a small pry bar and a hammer from his tool cart. He was supposed to report anomalies like this, but he had been dealing with the hospital's quirky, often undocumented, modifications for decades. It was probably just an old supply closet they had walled over during a renovation to save time and money. With a few sharp taps, he broke the plaster, revealing the faint outline of a doorframe beneath. The drywall came away in large, dusty sheets, exposing a solid wood door, still fitted with its original brass knob. The door was locked. Of course, it was. George sighed and went back to his cart, returning with a set of skeleton keys and tension wrenches. He was an amateur locksmith out of necessity, having taught himself how to bypass the old simple locks that were common throughout the older parts of the building. After a few moments of fiddling, the lock clicked with a loud snap that echoed in the dead quiet of the wing. He took a deep breath, the dust tickling his nose, and pulled the heavy door open. A wave of cold, musty air washed over him, far colder than the ambient temperature of the wing. It carried a strange, faint, and unpleasant odor, something metallic and vaguely organic. The room inside was pitch black. He shone his powerful flashlight into the space. It was a small, cramped closet, no bigger than a walk-in pantry. The shelves were empty, save for a few rusted cans of cleaning solvent and a pile of stiff yellowed rags in the corner. It was exactly what he expected, an unremarkable, forgotten utility space. He was about to close the door and move on, dismissing the strange smell as mold and old chemicals, when his light caught something on the back wall. It wasn't on a shelf, but down low, near the floorboards. He stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under his weight. Crouching down, he angled his light. Tucked deep inside a wide, dark gap where the wall met the floor, wedged behind a thick water pipe, was a canvas bag. It was grimy and stiff with age, almost the same color as the dusty floor around it. He reached into the dark, dusty space, his fingers closing around the stiff material. It was heavy. He pulled it out into the light, a cloud of disturbed dust motes dancing in the flashlight beam. It was a woman's tote bag, a simple canvas, designed with faded lettering from a local bookstore. His heart began to beat a little faster. This was not a maintenance item. This was personal. With a sense of trepidation, he placed the bag on the floor and carefully pried open the mildewed top. Inside, preserved in the cold, dry air of the sealed room, were the contents of a life interrupted. A well-worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, a wallet, a set of keys, a half-eaten granola bar, and a plastic hospital ID card. Photo on it faded but still clear. George stared at the face of the smiling young woman, her name printed in bold letters beneath her picture. Evelyn read. The name meant nothing to him, but he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he had just stumbled upon something terribly important. George Kowalski stood up slowly, his knees cracking in the profound silence of the north wing. He stared at the name on the ID card. Evelyn read, the face in the photo, a ghost from another era. He was just a maintenance man, a fixer of pipes and wires, but he understood the gravity of what he held in his hands. This bag wasn't just lost, it was hidden. The walled-over door, the out-of-the-way location, it was all deliberate. He backed out of the small, dark closet, pulling the heavy wooden door shut, suddenly feeling an urgent need to be out of that space. He immediately called his supervisor. His voice, usually so calm and steady, betraying a slight tremor. He didn't say what he had found, only that he had discovered something in the Old North Wing that the police needed to see immediately. His supervisor, accustomed to George's no-nonsense demeanor, didn't question him. The call was made, and within the hour, the quiet, dusty wing was suddenly alive with the hushed, professional energy of law enforcement. 2 uniformed officers arrived first, securing the area, followed by a pair of detectives from the cold case unit. One of the detectives was a young, ambitious woman named Isabella Rossi. The name Evelyn Reed was vaguely familiar to her. It was a legendary cold case in the department, one of the true what-if mysteries. She listened as George, his voice low, recounted his discovery of the walled-over room and the canvas bag tucked behind the pipe. She could see the disturbed dust, the fresh pry marks on the wall, the look of unease on the old maintenance worker's face. This was no prank. This was real. A forensics team was called in, and the decommissioned wing was officially declared a crime scene. 17 years late, they treated the small, musty closet with painstaking care, sweeping for fibers, hairs, fingerprints, any microscopic trace that might have survived the passage of time. The bag and its contents were carefully photographed, where they were found before being sealed in evidence containers for transport to the state crime lab. Every item, from the book to the granola bar, was now a potential key to unlocking a 7th secret. As the forensics team worked, Detective Rossi made a phone call. It was to a number she found in the old digital case file, listed as Primary Investigator Rhett. An older man answered, his voice gruff. "Miller," he said. Rossi introduced herself and began to explain where she was and what a maintenance worker had found. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, Miles Miller, his voice suddenly sharp and clear, said, "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Miller arrived, looking every bit the retired cop, dressed in a fishing vest and worn jeans, but his eyes were electric with an intensity that time had not diminished. He walked through the dusty wing, his gaze sweeping over everything, absorbing the details. When Rossi showed him the digital photos of the bag and its contents on her tablet, he stared at the image of the ID card. "Evie," he whispered, the name an old, familiar ache. The discovery of her bag, here, inside the hospital, confirmed a theory he had held onto for nearly 2 decades. She never made it to the parking garage. The contents of the bag were both heartbreakingly mundane and incredibly significant. The wallet contained her driver's license, a few dollars in cash, and credit cards that had never been used. This was powerful evidence against the theory that she had run away. People who planned to disappear typically take their money with them. The presence of her purse, hidden so carefully, strongly suggested she was the victim of a crime that had occurred right here, within these walls. The most crucial item, however, was something they couldn't see: the bag itself, the clothes she was wearing that day. The book, all of it would be subjected to advanced forensic analysis that didn't exist in 2008. They could now test for trace DNA, for genetic fingerprints left behind by a killer, with a precision that was once the stuff of science fiction. The cold, dry, and undisturbed environment of the sealed closet was the best-case scenario for evidence preservation. It was a time capsule, not just of Evie's last possessions, but potentially of her killer's identity. News of the discovery sent a shockwave through the police department, and soon, the city. A 17-year-old cold case had suddenly, miraculously, become hot. The media descended on St. Michael's, their news vans lining the street, their cameras pointed at the Old North Wing. The story of the vanished nurse was resurrected from the archives, and for the first time in years, there was a tangible reason to hope for a resolution. But for Detective Miller, the discovery brought a chilling realization. Hiding a bag is one thing, but hiding a body is another. The killer had to have been someone with intimate knowledge of the hospital's layout, someone who knew about this forgotten closet, knew it was about to be sealed during a renovation, and had the access and authority to move about the hospital unnoticed, even with a terrible secret to conceal. The suspect pool, which had once seemed impossibly large, had now narrowed dramatically. The killer wasn't just someone who knew Evie, they were almost certainly an employee of St. Michael's. The ghost that haunted these halls had a name, and Miller was determined to find it. The discovery of Evie Reed's tote bag transformed the cold case from a historical footnote into a high-priority, active investigation. The Oregon State Police Crime Lab went to work with a sense of urgency. applying 17 years of scientific advancement to the preserved evidence. Under a high-powered microscope, forensic technicians painstakingly examined every square inch of the canvas bag, the book, and the wallet. They were hunting for a ghost, a single cell of skin, a stray hair, a microscopic fiber that did not belong to Evie Reed. It was a slow, methodical process, a search for a needle in a 17-year-old haystack. Detective Rossi, with the grizzled and ever-present Miller acting as her unofficial consultant, began the daunting task of rebuilding the world of 2008. They needed to know who had access to the North Wing and who knew about the renovation plans that led to the closet being sealed. They pulled the hospital's employee records and construction manifests from that year, documents that had been buried in deep archival storage. A list of names began to form: janitors, security guards, maintenance workers, and construction contractors who had worked on the ground floor renovation project. Original case files were re-examined with fresh eyes. Every interview, every alibi, every unsubstantiated rumor was put under a new, more powerful lens. Miller and Rossi spent days in a small, windowless room, the walls covered with photos, timelines and blueprints of the old hospital wing. They were looking for connections, for overlaps between the original persons of interest and the new list of individuals with access to the hidden closet. The work was tedious, a grind of cross-referencing old data with new possibilities. Mark and Lily Reed were thrust back into a world of police interviews and media attention, a surreal echo of the nightmare they had endured 17 years ago. For Mark, it was a painful reopening of old wounds, but for Lily, it was the first time she felt a real, tangible connection to her mother's case. She met with Rossi and Miller, her intelligent questions and calm demeanor impressing both detectives. She provided them with what little she knew, a daughter's inherited memory of a mother she never got to know. The discovery gave her a fragile, terrifying hope for the one thing she had always been denied: closure. The breakthrough came from the crime lab. While the bag itself yielded no usable suspect DNA, a faint, partial fingerprint was lifted from the slick plastic cover of Evie's hospital ID card. Print did not belong to Evie. In 2008, a partial print like this would have been useless, too incomplete to find a match in the national database. But fingerprint matching technology had become exponentially more powerful. The partial print was digitized, enhanced, and run through the system, searching for a match against millions of records. Days later, Rossi's phone rang. It was the crime lab. They had a hit. The partial print was a match to a man named Arthur Finch. The name meant nothing to Rossi, so she ran it through the old hospital employee database. There he was. In 2008, Arthur Finch was a 45-year-old security guard at St. Michael's. He had worked a night shift. He had been on duty the night Evie Reed disappeared. And, according to the hospital records, he had quit his job abruptly, citing personal reasons. Just 2 weeks after the disappearance, suddenly, all the pieces began to click into place. Miller vaguely remembered Finch from the original investigation. He had been one of dozens of employees interviewed, a quiet, unremarkable man who kept to himself. His alibi had been simple. He was patrolling other parts of the hospital. With no evidence to the contrary, he had been quickly dismissed. But now, he was the prime suspect. As a security guard, he would have had keys to the entire facility, including the old North Wing. He would have known the hospital's blind spots, its forgotten corners, and its renovation schedules. The investigation now had a laser focus. Find Arthur Finch. A search of public records revealed he was still living in Oregon, in a small rural town about an hour outside of Portland. He was now 62 years old, retired, living a quiet, solitary life. There were no major crimes on his record since 2008, just a couple of minor traffic violations. To the outside world, he was just a quiet, older man. But to Rossi and Miller, he was the ghost they had been hunting for 17 years. The weight of the impending confrontation was immense. After so many years of silence, they were on the verge of uncovering the truth. They had to proceed with caution. They began surveillance on Finch's small, isolated house, wanting to understand his routines before they made their approach. They spoke with his neighbors, who described him as a recluse, a bit odd, but harmless. No one in his current life seemed to know anything about a dark secret he had carried for nearly 2 decades. The echo of the past was now a deafening roar. The old case files, the forgotten blueprints, the whispers in the hall, it was all converging on one man, The fingerprint on Evie's ID card was the critical link, the physical evidence that connected Arthur Finch to Evie Reed at the moment her life was ending. The final question that remained was the most important one. Why? What had happened in that brief, unobserved window of time between the hospital exit and the parking garage that had led to her murder and 17 years of silence? The arrest warrant was served on a grey, drizzly morning, the kind of weather that seemed to define Portland's melancholic beauty. Detectives Rossi and Miller, accompanied by a small team of state troopers, drove down the long gravel driveway to Arthur Finch's isolated home. Finch answered the door himself, a stooped, grey-haired man with pale, watery eyes. When he saw the police, there was no surprise, no outrage, only a quiet, weary resignation, as if he had been expecting this knock on his door for 17 years. He surrendered without a word. In the sterile, white-walled interrogation room, Arthur Finch was a study in stillness. He sat for nearly an hour in complete silence as Detective Rossi laid out the evidence, the discovery of the bag, the walled-over room he would have had access to, his abrupt departure from the hospital. Then, she placed a magnified photo of the fingerprint from Evie's ID card on the table in front of him. It was at that moment that the dam of 17 years of silence finally broke. He began to talk, his voice a low, raspy monotone, the terrible truth spilling out in a slow, emotionless confession. It wasn't a crime of passion or premeditated evil, he explained, but a pathetic, tragic accident born of obsession. Finch had developed a fixation on Evie Reed. He admired her from afar, watching her kindness with patience, the way she seemed to radiate a gentle light in the grim reality of the oncology ward. He never spoke to her beyond a polite good evening. In his lonely, isolated world, this one-sided admiration curdled into a possessive fantasy. He believed they had a special connection, a silent understanding. On that October night, he saw her leaving the ward. On a twisted impulse, he decided to approach her, not in the public lobby, but in the deserted service corridor that led to the west exit. He just wanted to talk to her, to finally tell her how he felt. He stepped out in front of her, and she was startled, scared. His presence in the empty hallway was jarring, out of place. She didn't see a secret admirer. She saw a threat. She tried to push past him, her reaction one of pure fear, not the gentle understanding he had fantasized about. In his panic, to make her stay and listen. He grabbed her arm. She screamed, a short, sharp cry that was muffled by the thick concrete walls. Terrified that someone would hear, he clamped his hand over her mouth to silence her. They struggled for only a moment. He was stronger, and in his clumsy, desperate attempt to subdue her, he pushed her backward. Evie stumbled, her head striking the corner of a steel doorframe with a sickening crack. She went limp, sliding to the floor. It was over in an instant. Finch described the chilling clarity that followed his panic. He knew he had to hide her. He was on duty, alone in a deserted part of the hospital. He dragged her body into the nearest unlocked room, the janitorial closet in the north wing. He knew it was scheduled to be sealed off the very next day. In a daze, he took her tote bag, his fingerprint branding her ID card as he fumbled with it, and wedged it behind the pipe, a foolish attempt to make it look like a robbery. He then used a maintenance dolly to move her body to the hospital's sub-basement incinerator, a piece of equipment used for biological waste, and in the dead of night, he erased every physical trace of Evelyn Reed. The confession was devastating. In its banality, there was no monster, just a lonely, delusional man and a single, stupid, violent act that had spiraled into a lifetime of secrets. He had lived with the guilt and fear every single day for 17 years. The memory of her fall, the quiet of her death, a constant presence in his mind. Quitting his job was an act of self-preservation, an attempt to flee the building that held his terrible secret. He had gotten away with it, but he was never truly free. With the confession, the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Lack of a body, the absence of forensic evidence in the parking garage, the mystery of the sealed room, it all made a terrible kind of sense. Arthur Finch was charged with the murder of Evelyn Reed. The news brought a sense of profound, if somber, closure to the city that had been captivated by her disappearance for so long. The ghost of St. Michael's finally had a name and a story. For Mark and Lily Reed, the truth was a brutal, heartbreaking relief. The not knowing had been a unique form of torture, and the reality, as horrible as it was, provided a final, definitive answer. There was no secret life, no abandonment, just a senseless act of violence that had stolen Evie from them. They attended every day of Arthur Finch's trial, listening to the details of Evie's last moments, a process that was both excruciating and necessary. Lily, now a young woman who looked so much like her mother, finally had the truth she had sought for so long. The story of Evelyn Reed serves as a powerful, tragic reminder of how a life can be erased in a single, unobserved moment, and how the echoes of that moment can reverberate for decades. It is a story of the enduring love of a family that refused to stop searching for answers, and the quiet persistence of a detective who never let the case go cold. And it is a testament to the fact that sometimes the most terrible truths are hidden in the most ordinary of places, waiting in silence for a curious maintenance worker to simply open a forgotten door.